complicated, you know, man. Like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Charles Haywood, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I am doing well, and I am pleased to be here. Thank you for having me on.
I'm excited to have you on. So a little bit of background. Roughly a year or so ago, just before I started this podcast, I was commuting roughly 400 miles a week, which gives you plenty of time to listen to audio material. And what I found through Alex Kashuta's Subversive podcast is the work of Charles Haywood. So Charles, if you could describe, who you are and, what your body of work is on the internet.
Sure. So working backwards, my body of work on the internet, I write at my own website, theworthyhouse.com, though I also cross-publish at other places. I'll link to Twitter, and I have a YouTube channel that has audio versions of my content and so on. But the central place is my own website. And the function of the website, which I've had for 6 years or so, 5 or 6 years, is its surface purpose is to write book reviews. But of course, as it's developed, these book reviews are not actually book reviews or not solely book reviews, though I will talk about books quite frequently. They're vehicles for me to deliver my own thoughts, in which I try to make a coherent whole rather than repeating myself, which means that I select the books usually with an eye to what my own thoughts are going to be about them, rather than simply because I pick the books at random, though not infrequently there are random books too. I also write what my wife calls original pieces. I mean, all my pieces are original, but by original pieces that are not tied to specific books, or in some cases are tied to a very large number of books. For example, I read every English language book in existence, which is not that many, but is several, on the Finnish Civil War, and then wrote a piece on the Finnish Civil War. So it's not a book review technically, but of course, much of it is informed by books. And the reason I did this originally was simply to fix in my own mind the content of books that I'd read, because I don't have a great memory. But over time, it's developed into me attempting to develop a applied political philosophy, which I call foundationalism. So that's what I do, in the sense of I do for public consumption. In my past life, many years ago, I was a mergers and acquisitions lawyer in Chicago. And then I quit that and ran a shampoo making business for some years. And I sold that 2 years ago. So now in real life, when I'm not spending time on the internet, which I try not to spend too much time actually on the internet, when I'm not spending time on the internet, I play gentleman farmer, and I raise chickens and a bunch of children. Sometimes the chickens are more, sometimes less trouble than the children, and things like that. So I have no other public presence. I don't work out in the real world. I don't work for political candidates or anything like that. I'm just some guy in Indiana.
So I'm curious. This is a relatively odd and small corner of the internet. How did you end up here?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a small corner of the internet, and that's something that I think sometimes people forget. Though I do think what's sometimes called the dissident right, but I'm not sure I really totally like that term, punches above its weight. But that aside, I ended up here just kind of naturally. My politics have always been conservative since I was a small child, no doubt influenced by my parents. But as I've pointed out before, and to my eternal shame, I voted, for example, for George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004, because I'm old enough to have done so. And my kind of positions, I think, have become more radical over time, or more, to use the Kashuta term, subversive over time. And that's just a function of being informed by history. I mean, this is kind of the natural place for people who are interested in history and actually learn the lessons that history teaches us, rather than approaching the world ideologically. I mean, one of my bête noirs is ideologies, that is the preconceived conceptions of how the world should work and how we can make the world work. Foundationalism is explicitly not an ideology. And this corner of the internet, as you call it, is a place that's fundamentally reality based rather than ideology based, and so that's kind of a natural point for me.
So you bring up the philosophy you've been kind of working at, foundationalism. So as kind of a quick, napkin sketch, could you describe like the core tenets of foundationalism?
Oh yeah, I can't do all 12 core tenets on a napkin, and I do have a lengthy piece on my site about it for people who are interested in digging deeper. But fundamentally, foundationalism is the applied politics of reality. That is, it's a call to use a set of basic principles to organically revolve a reborn or remade society around. And so those principles range from some that are kind of straightforward, subsidiarity, or an economy that is not as radically free market as some people might desire, but rather designed to serve society, through things that contain kind of a moral / organizational component, also reflecting reality, such as a return to traditional sex roles, along with things which most people wouldn't lump together in the same fold as some of those other ideas. The first pillar is actually space. That is, I am strongly in favor of technology, or rather some types of technology, and in particular, space exploration, manned, not manned, what have you. But I think that is a crucial component of any future achieving society. So it sounds like it's kind of a grab bag. I think it actually fits together pretty well the way I lay it out. But what it's not is some path to perfection. I'm not promising that if you follow these principles and you do X, Y, and Z precisely, mankind is going to reach utopia. The idea is that these principles, applied with an eye to the actual society in which they are attempted to be applied, will lead to a maximum, but not a perfection, a maximum of human flourishing. And that's really the goal for a society.
So, and I spoke to you about this briefly before we went live. I think that because this corner of the internet is incredibly diverse, there are fault lines. And some of the fault lines are more real than others. I think some of them are more aesthetic or just kind of personality based. But one of the core ones is kind of tech optimism versus tech pessimism. And you've described yourself as a tech optimist. Can you explain why you feel optimistic about technology?
Yes. I think that technology is a tool that can be used to advance society, while at the same time, it can be a danger. So but I think that the idea that somehow technology is inherently bad, or that we should not strive to achieve ever greater things using technology, necessarily leads to a sclerotic, static society. You're either moving forward or you're moving backward. And so in the nature of things, in Western societies in particular, moving forward has always been within the nature of Western societies. Now, it's an open question whether the West as a thing will survive or whether something else will replace it, or what have you. But I think that technological capabilities can continue to be advanced. I mean, I, for example, don't think artificial intelligence is a thing. I don't think driverless cars will ever arrive. So I don't believe that all technologies will arrive. And I think some technologies are bad. Certain forms of gene editing, chimeric creatures, things like that are very bad. But I think that technology properly used can drive mankind forward, and therefore we should focus on it. At the same time, I mean, I agree I'm a tech optimist, but I also think, and people might think this is a contradiction, but it's not, that we have reached apogee in the West and in the whole world, because technology is basically a Western thing, and are falling backwards for a variety of reasons. But fundamentally, the ruling classes of our country, or of the West, or the regime, or however you want to say it, have made it so that technology now can, in practice, make no further advancements. So in order to make any real further technological advancements, you would have to fundamentally remake society. So that doesn't sound very optimistic. I mean, I place all these conditions on it and hedge it around, but I think in the right circumstances, technology is an important driver of a future successful society.
So one of the other main questions that I'm always just curious what people think, that you describe the system of foundationalism as, effectively reality based, right? Like interfacing with kind of like the objective, I guess, like material conditions, that human nature, things like that.
Yes.
So assuming, which I think is a pretty reasonable assumption, that the people in power are not operating, in such a way, right? Are not operating in accordance with reality. Do you believe that that is malicious choice, like an active disregard, or do you think that they just can't help themselves? They're so degraded as a class that they can't make it work.
Well, mostly the latter. That is my belief, and I actually wrote a lengthy piece recently that got a fair bit of traffic on this. My belief, contrary to some beliefs of other people in this corner of the internet, is that the regime is fundamentally incompetent and fragile. And by fragile, I don't mean powerless. I mean completely unable to withstand any kind of crisis. So fundamentally, the regime, or our ruling classes, it would be another way of putting it, have backed us into a corner where our society has so much unreality that the unreality will get squeezed out, and sooner rather than later, because that's just the way the world works. I mean, part of reality is that reality asserts itself. When you spend all your time denying reality, it will eventually bite you.
Well, to a certain extent, we've kind of built ourselves Lysenko world. Instead of just farming, which obviously, farming and food production is quite important, we have substituted ideology in for kind of the basic building blocks of not just one field, but essentially every field put together. And I was kind of thinking about this at work today because, after graduating, college this year, I have been kind of out of, let's just say white collar work. And so I've done a series of, by no means bad jobs, but, like lower paying jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm currently working at a large factory.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this kind of cadre of thoroughly unimpressive, morbidly obese Black women who all day or like week in and week out are wearing, I served U.S. Army, everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just one of those things where you sit there and you're like, wait a minute, how did you, which I mean, look, I'm sure this is not like a moral condemnation of them, but, how do you as a very, very large woman?
My wife, who's Australian, she was very confused at first. She has some military background herself. I mean, she wasn't in the military, but she has connections to the military and or the Australian military. And she was very confused that Americans referred to veterans as anybody who was paid by the army or by the armed services, as opposed to people who had actually fought. So because here, we thank people who worked in supply chain in Topeka, stuffing their face with donuts for their service, when in fact they served nothing. And so, I mean, maybe that goes to the point. I don't know what the specifics of those people were, but it's definitely true that that's just one of the multifarious examples of the fact that much of our society is based upon parasitism. That is, the regime allows a huge number of people to do nothing of value to society or affirmatively destructive of value, and to receive compensation that allows value, that allows them to purchase things and so on. That's fundamentally a core type of unreality.
Right. And I hate to say it. And look, who knows? Maybe these women in their previous careers, were storming Hamburger Hill and, just happened to, let it all go to seed, so to speak, the instant they got out of the service. That could be the case. I'm inclined to doubt it. But there is a part of you that kind of thinks like, oh, I know why. This was a beneficial demographic, right? Like we needed X% of these people. And so you see this, and definitely as well as in the corporate world and the university world, that the ideology of, oh, we need our organization to look like X, Y, or Z trumps the efficacy of, well, we need someone to do the job. And so my point is not to just, excoriate these women. It's just to say that level of, ideological rule, ideological capture it's running rampant. And so I guess I would agree with your diagnosis there.
Well, I mean, I don't want to pick on these people who may be very nice people who love
Right,
their grandchildren, but I mean, they definitely weren't storming Hamburger Hill, because no woman has ever stormed Hamburger Hill.
Right, exactly. I said that somewhat sarcastically.
Pieces on. I mean, women in the military is not only a bad idea as in terms of societal structures, but is probably the supreme example of the triumph of ideology over common sense. That is, women have gotten lots of people killed in the military and have accomplished nothing of value in our military or anybody's military, with the exception of occasional guerrilla wars and so on. So, I mean, if there was one example of modern stupidity, though admittedly I have to have so many hundreds of examples that maybe I'm overstating this one. Maybe I can find another one that's even worse. But women in the military, it may be the supreme modern stupidity.
Well, right. And it's interesting because it kind of dovetails with another, kind of impossible to discuss topic, which is kind of the paradox of female happiness, where we essentially find that as, the level of liberation for women increases over time. They're afforded more and more rights and privileges by the regime. They are always sold with this promise of, it will make, it'll make everyone's lives better, and you see this kind of like emotive language, of like the famous, post of Hillary Clinton, posting her first grade school photo, like little did she know she would be president. It's all this like hopeful language.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And so you would expect, that if that were even slightly true, we would see some type of improvement in female happiness. And instead of an improvement, or instead of even, a steady state, we see this dramatic collapse. Female suicide rates are approaching male suicide rates. And so, at least to me, when you see this, you come to the conclusion that, they don't care. That really, like, if the objective was happiness, if the purpose of the machine was what it said on the outside, we would adopt, different behavior. But to me, and this is why I very much resonate with your condemnation of ideology, is that ideology is a tool. Ideology is not the actual way the game is played, so to speak. And so I do feel a deep amount of sympathy. And I think that this is something that is especially apparent in people slightly older than me. Because at my age, right, you can still be 23 and dumb, and it hasn't really caught up to you yet.
Sure.
But I think you've seen this rash of articles of, millennial to Gen X women, who are in their late 30s to 40s, and essentially have kind of followed the lie, have followed the path that you're supposed to take. And not only have they not accomplished the great things that they were supposed to, but they've been left these kind of like empty, horrible lives as cat ladies.
Yeah.
And I think that, and maybe this is, like an overly evangelical, not in a religious sense, but like in a, the adjectival sense, like way to look at it. But there's a certain part where it's like, I'm not slavishly devoted to quote unquote women's causes, but if people like you and I win, they win too. Like this is a poor solution for everyone involved.
Sure. I mean, the regime's goal is not happiness for people. The regime's goal is ideological, and one of the two main goals of the left, that is to say the regime, is emancipation. So the idea that women should be able to do all these things that have traditionally been done by men is fundamentally an emancipatory impulse. And as you say, they sell people on this lie. And I'm older than you, and I know personally a tremendous amount of these women, both in my family, and I used to be a lawyer. And for example, in law firms, so I started as a lawyer 25 years ago. I only practiced for like 6 or 7 years. And even back then, the degree to which women were cosseted and, guaranteed employment and raised to partner and so on, just average women, not, women of Black women or any other preferred identity characteristic. And yet at a very high rate, they would leave the law firm as soon as they had their first child because it was incompatible with what they really wanted. And the people who didn't do that generally didn't have children and ended up, as you say, old and alone. And I know a bunch of these people. And this is just, this is just no way to run a society. The traditional separation of roles of men and women, where women have roles that are honored that are not the roles of men, and men have roles that are not the roles of women, it was set up that way for a reason. It was not because the patriarchy liked to oppress women. I mean, these things are just kind of obvious to anyone who views history objectively, but that's a relatively small group, as I say.
Well, and this is one of the things that I truly find irritating about the framing of a lot of the, well, and I've completely stolen this phrase from you, and it's because I like it quite a bit, but the catamite right. It is the adoption of the framing method of our enemies, right? So these are the right wingers, and I count in people like David French and Rod Dreher, as well as the kind of like the National Review crowd.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where they present themselves as conservatives, they present themselves as right wingers, for as much as that term means anything. But they view those values within the framework that their enemies created for them.
Yes.
So they've almost kind of adopted a premise which is incompatible with the conclusion that they're pushing. And so it's no shock that they fold, because they essentially have been building a wall with the bricks their enemies hand them.
Yes.
And big shock, right? When you're concerned about, and I realize this can be misconstrued, but if you're concerned, your primary goal is, liberation, but the liberation of 1984 or 1992. If that's your goal, you have still granted that the goal in any way is liberation. And so you're essentially given, as a voter, the choice between, top shelf liberation and the cheap stuff. And then there's no shock that these people never win at anything.
Well, that's the whole intellectual dark web thing. It's funny you mentioned Dreher, because you probably didn't see this, but there was a little contretemps on Twitter where he was attacking some person at a school that his kids went to or something, publicly, viciously attacking him for apparently being too far to the right. Though honestly, I have no idea what the guy said, because I didn't care. So I commented on Dreher's Twitter feed, who cares? No enemies to the right. And Dreher immediately, and I mean immediately, like within like a couple hours, had a whole piece up attacking me without naming me. Though he actually knows exactly who I am, because we actually have interacted in real life. So now I'm about to have a piece attacking him in I Am 1776. I don't know if you're familiar with that online journal. Pretty soon here. And much of it revolves around the kind of stuff you were just saying, that these people accept the frame of the left, are always trying to police the rightward boundaries, and don't really have any sense of what the winning condition would be. If you ask Dreher, like, how are you going to win? I mean, short of saying whatever religious beliefs I'm on now need to be implemented by the state, maybe, I mean, he wouldn't say that because he would hem and haw, but in his own mind, it's not clear what he thinks winning would look like. I mean, I have a very clear idea of what winning would look like. He doesn't.
Well, it's very much like the kind of like the tired old analogy of the dog chasing the car, right? Where the dog has no idea what to do once it's actually caught the car.
Yeah.
And it's very much that idea of, and I really do think that there is, and I hate to psychologize, that's a tool of our enemy. But nonetheless, there is this idea that I do think that there is a type of person who almost enjoys losing and saying, well, I told you so. Like, wait, you'll be sorry one day.
No, I think it's people who just like enjoy losing because it's like beautiful, like all this scrutinism, a beautiful loser.
Right. Yeah. No. That's what the power of that phrase. So just a little bit of background. I also know Dreher. I'm familiar with that story, and I was similarly annoyed by it. Because to me, and this is always hard, because it's difficult when you have had an intellectual journey, like all of us have, to look back on people that were impactful on that journey, but you look back at them with kind of a certain amount of disdain.
Yeah.
So for me, The Benedict Option was an incredibly impactful book, because there's kind of a core, and I'm not a huge fan of the red pill analogy, but we'll use it for the sake of discussion. There's kind of a core red pill in that book, which is quote unquote conservative Christians are not the minority or are not the majority. They were a minority and they have to act like it. You know, that's kind of a splash of cold water in the face if you live in red America. And then, so I realize I owe that to him. But to me, right, when you have literally written a book and in his style, right, it's kind of this like half sappy self-reflection, you know, half actual argument, all about, you know, how Christians should be dissidents, you know, how Christians should be willing to accept being, you know, unpopular and, you know, accepting the force of the state. And then the minute someone expresses an unpopular opinion, you know, he's got his hands up in the air shrieking, saying, punish him, cast him out, you know, get him out of my community. There's a certain part where it's like, well, wait a minute. Have you read your own book?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's too bad. Yeah, I feel bad because I, like you, have read Dreher for a long time, and I have a lot of respect for him. But somewhere along the way, he lost the plot, or maybe the world passed him by. I mean, I think that, you know, that's an occupational hazard. The world passes by most people who are important to a movement. It's very rare. I mean, typically people perform their function and then they're superseded by other people, younger people, people with more ideas applicable to the actual present moment, or maybe they change and they're unable to. They say, well, I came to these conclusions and other people are reaching different conclusions because times have changed, and I just can't abide by that. So it's a little bit sad to see, and his personal life is, I think, a mess as well, which he insists on telling everybody. But you know, I don't wish him ill. Certainly, it's just unfortunate.
No, that's well said, and I don't want to turn this into, you know, just us, you know, complaining about someone we have we have political disagreements with. So one of the other things that I think is if we can continue the theme of, you know, accepting your enemy's values, is that if we are, there's kind of this tension on, you know, the internet, right, of, you know, novelty versus tradition, in the sense that on one hand, you can't go back. You know, you cannot go back to a previous version of society. That's just not how reality works. You know, there is a real synthesis of ideas. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, this kind of endless desire for, you know, something new and something exciting, like that's not our turf, so to speak. And so I liked what you said about Dreher in the sense that this is easier to see in historical figures. You know, like if I ask you, well, what are the core contributions of someone like Hegel or Kant? You know, maybe you could rattle off, you know, one or two, you know, three or four even great ideas. And if you're not arrogant enough to assume you're even that good of a thinker, which I for one don't think I'm that caliber of a thinker. You're like, do I really have that many great ideas to contribute? You know, like, do I really have like that many amazing, you know, like earth-shattering things to add to the conversation? And so I guess it's good to have a little bit of sympathy with someone like Dreher, who in all likelihood has just been passed by, you know, kind of by the course of the conversation. And that's what happens to everyone, I guess.
Right, but I think that's also well said. I think leaving Dreher aside entirely, I mean, you know, that's why the subtitle, as it were, for Foundationalism, and the subtitle of my site itself is The Politics of Future Past. That is, nostalgia is entirely crippling. And this idea that we can return to some past is, as you say, you know, a complete fantasy. You know, the future is going to be very different than from the past. What you want is the future informed by the wisdom of the past, not an attempt to duplicate the past, which, well, typically the past was better than modern historians or modern ideologues would have you admit. That history is full of very bad things as well, and the future will be full of very bad things. So all we're trying to do is forge the way forward while maximizing the benefits to society as a whole, understanding that all sorts of bad things are going to happen and all sorts of bad people are going to do bad things. But if you spend all your time saying how great it was in, you know, the kingdom of Louis IX or something, you're just never going to get anywhere.
And that brings up another thing that I found interesting in your work, is that oftentimes there's this conflation of moral progress and technological progress. And you do a good job of distinguishing between the two things. You know, the idea that men are a constant and technology is changing.
Mhm.
because, and you see this very much in kind of the, the 70s liberal sci-fi, the idea that, well, if we have enough technology, we can perfect ourselves. We can take away our desire to, to kill, to, rob the liquor stores of the future, whatever people get up to. And so I think it is important to draw a distinction between technological progress and moral progress.
Well,
Do you see what I'm getting at?
I totally agree. I don't think technological progress is moral progress. And in many ways, technological progress creates moral hazards. It's funny you talk about 1970s science fiction, because I used to read about 1980s, I guess, science fiction when I was little. And before I became, my modern science fiction is just unbelievably bad. That said, I do think that there's a lot to be said for the series of both the books and the TV series, The Expanse. Are you familiar with that at all?
I've been recommended it, but I have no familiarity at all.
It's actually excellent. I mean, it depends upon. I mean, it depends upon something which is unrealistic, but is in fact necessary for any real future technological advancement, which is fundamentally a limitless new energy source. But leaving that part aside, it's basically the story of the advancing out into the solar system, so the moon, Mars, and so on. And it ultimately becomes a bit more freaky. But my point is that it does an excellent job of depicting the way such a society would actually be, as opposed to most science fiction, which basically is this, as you say, implies that because we can do these things, now we're better human beings. I mean, the series has lots of drawbacks. Like, it has a ton of women characters, not a single one of whom is actually a woman. I mean, they're all men who are, have the physical, they act like men, they behave like men, they have the capabilities and skills of men, but the external characteristics of women. So that's kind of silly. I mean, real space colonization would involve no women at all doing anything dangerous, but would have to have women in a protected role. If you can get over some of those things, it's actually an excellent series. Highly recommended.
Well, it's interesting, and I was thinking about this because the most recent episode of my podcast was actually a discussion of Forever War, right? Like the mid-70s sci-fi classic. And it's interesting because that book on one hand has kind of astonishingly sharp observations about society as it is currently, but it's backloaded with the kind of Star Trek vision of the future, where it's like, oh, just given enough time, we'll, become these kind of like new men, with no need for, like war or pain or anything like that. And I've always thought that's interesting because part of me wonders if the reason sci-fi has died is because sci-fi is kind of the goal, or like the real explosion of sci-fi is kind of tied up with the Cold War, in the way that it kind of deals with themes of, annihilation, kind of escaping annihilation and, like war on a scale previously unseen. And so I almost wonder if kind of like rock and roll or the gangster film, if it's kind of almost an artifact of an era. Do you agree with that? Or do you think that that's...
I think that's an interesting insight. I think I agree with that, certainly, but I would add something else. That is, I definitely think that belief that we need to achieve a new society in order to fundamentally change mankind in order to avoid annihilation is an artifact of the Cold War. But at the same time, I think the utopian impulse is something that is inherent to the left. It's related to emancipation and forced equality, which I think are the two pillars of left ideology, but combined what they're supposed to lead to in kind of the left, they're supposed to lead to the left eschaton. And you see this way back. I mean, you see this way back even in like 18th century Enlightenment writers. You see it in H.G. Wells before the First World War. So I think what you're seeing is kind of the twin streams of left utopianism, the idea that we will be as gods in some way, combined with we need to be as gods because otherwise we're all going to be annihilated. I hadn't really picked up on that latter theme that you mentioned. I've always focused on the utopianism part, but I do think they go together. But I think that's gone now. I mean, well, maybe not. I think there's a lot. I mean, I read nearly as much science fiction as I used to because it's all tripe. But you now have different annihilationist tendencies. Global warming is going to kill us all, kind of stuff. So maybe it's still going on. I'm not picking up on it.
Well, it's almost the dark reflection of the positive spirit of Western man, right? So Spengler would call it, Faustian, but it's what you point out is the need for us to kind of sink or swim as a civilization, right? We need to press out into space. We need to constantly be innovating, be striving for something. But instead of kind of a concrete, real physical goal of, essentially territory conquered, right? Like the exploring tendency. It's that same desire to, overcome and innovate and kind of strive single-mindedly towards a goal. But instead of a bigger version of flawed society, it is the perfected version of society. And I think that those two things are linked, that desire to kind of drive towards a distant goal, whereas one is kind of the twisted, like kind of a corrupted version of the other.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. I mean, the utopia, the problem with the utopian vision of things is that since you can't get it, you can't even make any steps toward it. It tends to lead to a great deal of frustration and unhappiness, combined with, at the margins, a willingness to do anything against people you think are holding back this utopian vision. So utopian visions of that type are extremely dangerous when, to the extent people try to apply them to real life situations.
That's well said. So one of the other things that I've found interesting in your work is what I would say is your practical advice. So just going off of demographics, my viewers tend to be overwhelmingly male. Out of a few thousand listens across different platforms, I will get 1, 2, 3 women per episode, right? It's essentially all guys, and it tends to be younger. And so one of the other things that I think is an interesting split in our circles is college, is university a necessary evil, right? Like you still have to go because it's your ticket to the laptop class, the PMC, upper middle class.
Sure.
Or is it essentially like an ideological indoctrination center? And if you send your kids, you're going to lose them. So I know that you fall on one side of that. So would you kind of describe your position?
Yeah, I mean, I of course am in a little bit different position because I'm in the position of sending my kids to college in the future, in the relatively near future, not of whether I myself should go to college. I mean, I did all the different degrees, and I have all these degrees, and I was a member of the professional managerial class, and that worked out fine for me. Though ultimately, I didn't. I went into manufacturing on my own. But I mean, my opinion is very strongly that people should not join or make any efforts to join the professional managerial class, the PMC. And the reason for that is because there's no future in that. Because I think that since my thesis is the regime is fragile, that necessarily implies that the regime is going to fracture, the stupidity is going to be squeezed out of the system, and since essentially 80 or 90% of PMC jobs are purely parasitical. That is, they produce either zero or negative net value to society. Those jobs are simply going to disappear. So if you spend your time now pursuing that kind of job and completely not developing any abilities that are more resilient, then you're going to, if my theory or my predictions are correct, that's going to be very bad for you and bad for any family that depends on you in the very near future. By very near future, I would say before or approaching 2030. And so I would never have my children follow the path that I did, becoming a lawyer, for example. I would probably affirmatively forbid my children from becoming lawyers. I might allow them to become doctors, for example, even though that's really part of the PMC, because being a doctor is a useful skill. I mean, that's its own set of problems now because the profession is hugely ideologized, and obviously, if you're white, it's almost impossible to get a fair break, et cetera, et cetera. But you could become a doctor, and but short of being a doctor or some other useful element, very narrow set of elements in the PMC, I would encourage my children to do almost anything else than join the PMC. And that would typically mean there's no real need for them to go to college.
Yeah, it's interesting. And someone who just recently graduated from university, I have an extraordinarily dim view of it. I mean, in addition to kind of the pre-existing problems essentially COVID broke education in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not necessarily proud to admit it, but it is nonetheless true that during COVID and even afterwards, nothing was accomplished whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And largely it was just a game theory problem, where it's like, well, either I can do A, whatever I want and get an A, or B, work my butt off and get an A. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what, most people, and myself included, it's not what I should have done, but nonetheless, it's what happened. And so you have this kind of already incredibly rickety system, which is essentially designed to just siphon resources from you, from the state. And for what, right? To produce, unqualified people for jobs that don't need to be done. And okay, maybe a certain percentage of people can live like that. But, it's this kind of like eternal goal to send more people and more people and more people to higher education. Again, much like women's liberation, as a good in and of itself, you do start to just crunch the numbers in your head and you're like, well, how long can this go on for?
Yeah. Well,
to me,
I think it's not just education, though. It's probably the most startling example. I mean, very little of any value is being accomplished, being done across all of society. It's a big problem.
No, definitely. And one of the interesting things to me about this is, so I'm, a nerd with varied interests. And, graduating with a finance degree, right before one of the biggest recessions ever, that is totally not a recession, guys, I promise, despite the fact that the NASDAQ is down 28% year to date or year over year. Nothing wrong with that, right? Just normal fluctuation. But, you have a lot of time to crunch numbers. And it's interesting because there's a big conversation essentially about, have we really ever stopped being in a recession? Since roughly the early 2000s, because there's essentially been so much, like monkeying around with data, so much kind of sweeping things under the rug, and so much kind of creation of fake value, and you've seen this with the giant kind of return to the mean of tech companies, the way that a lot of tech companies, and some of it is, and I don't mean to get into, a discussion about tax law, because that's quite literally the least interesting thing I can even, imagine talking about. But essentially this whole system where the big earners, as far as stocks go, are essentially companies that don't make money and don't really produce anything. It's all like this eternal, like, oh, it'll make it big one day, and when it'll make it big one day goes on for 15 years, you start to look around and you're like, wait a minute, what do we actually do? Yeah. Like, really, like, what is being made? Look, I get it that software is a useful thing. We need software to do certain things, but it seems like we're very much far past the point of diminishing returns when it comes to complexity in certain ways.
Well, software is a useful thing, but there's actually a debate over whether computers in general have increased net productivity to any significant degree at all. That is, so it's not at all clear that computers or software, I guess more narrowly, have benefited even the economy. And I think that your point about the past 15 years and since 2000 is an excellent one, because I'm old enough that I can remember the 1980s. And in the 1980s, it is impossible for me to communicate to young people like my children what a hopeful, bright time the 1980s were. And it wasn't just because I was in high school in the late 1980s. I was kind of a loser in high school. Well, the 1980s weren't that great for me personally, but the societal attitude, and that kind of went into the 1990s as well. We'd won the Cold War. Everything was going to be great forever. And then 1999, 2000 hit. And as far as I'm concerned, everything has been in the crapper in terms of both, pretty much everything, attitudinally, societal progress, societal future, since roughly 2000. And as far as the specifics of with those companies, for example, you mentioned that are big but don't actually do anything. There's a couple books to read that are useful on that. Like Mariana Mazzucato, who's a left-wing economist, has a book called The Value of Everything, which I have a discussion of. But basically, she shows how GDP is essentially a fake figure that doesn't contain the numbers that are used to generate GDP don't actually reflect the production of value. And this guy named David Graeber, who actually died a year or two ago, young, who wrote a book, Bullshit Jobs, which is also very good. Both these people are left wing, on the well on the left wing, but their points about the fakeness of the vast majority of the so-called productive economic activity are extremely well taken.
Well, and I think that there's a broader problem that is essentially no one can answer the question, what is the purpose of society? Like essentially that there's kind of this empty place of like, well, if the purpose of society isn't to continue on, our genetic lineage, right? We see a lot of antinatalism. We see this idea that, we are a virus on the face of the earth. Well, we don't really have the Cold War anymore. We don't have this enemy to conquer. And then it's like, well, the consumerism angle isn't working quite as well because all of our consumer goods are static or dropping in quality. That these great leaps forward in standard of living have not materialized. There's this kind of crisis point where it's like, well, why? Like, what's the point of this whole thing? And look, I'm not saying that, things, because look, like I am very much a, kind of like a child of the ashes, right? Like I am young enough that while I was alive, I don't remember 9/11. I was born in 99. And so I think that there is this, the part of the reason that we've suffered this cultural malaise, this lack of optimism, is that there's really nothing to strive for on a civilizational level anymore.
Yes, absolutely. Nothing to add to that. I think it's exactly right.
And I guess that is the utility of something like a Journey into the Stars, right? That gives us this massive, and I hate using universal language because I'm very much a particularist, but this kind of like species-wide goal.
Yes, it's a binding goal that brings society together and gives us something to strive for and something to achieve. I mean, we'll never get anywhere near space. We've fallen backwards other than for the stuff that Elon Musk is doing. The traditional space stuff is can do far less than it used to. Exemplified by this NASA's Artemis thing, whose prime goal is to put a black woman on the moon. We did that 50 years ago, not a black woman, but who cares? But if you under the right circumstances, that we could make a lot of progress there, and that would be extremely good for society, or not for this society necessarily. I suspect this society will have to be written off in an entirely new or largely new one formed from the ashes, and not just the ashes you're talking about, but unfortunately, probably more ashes. But that's the way the cookie crumbles. So
one of the somewhat frustrating things is that whenever and I'm not talking about you particularly, but whenever a person discusses, kind of like civilizational collapse, the image that springs into people's mind is Mad Max. Like people in leathers, running around the woods with, eating each other and, driving crazy cars. So what do you think is a reasonable version of collapse? What do you think that will look like?
Right. I mean, I tend to use the word fracture rather than collapse because, as you say, collapse either conjures up Mad Max or conjures up people immediately default to thinking about Rome and arguing about how long it took Rome to collapse and what that looked like for people in Rome or in the provinces and what have you. And I don't think that's really what we're talking about. I mean, as far as the Mad Max scenario, that's completely ahistorical. In the West, anarchy, the longest time anarchy has existed in any significant area is about 10 minutes. I mean, in the West, anarchy simply does not exist for any significant period of time. People will always reform a society simply because that's the smart and practical thing to do. I mean, it may be very different from the old society, but under external pressure resulting from a fracture, whether that's an asteroid hitting or the economy collapsing or a real pandemic, people will move ahead and move forward in organized ways. So Mad Max is never going to happen. And that's even leaving aside that in the real world, for people who are predators in a Mad Max scenario, given the amount of guns floating around America, that's a very short life expectancy career. I mean, it just wouldn't work out in practice for ad hoc bands of people to run around looting. They just end up dead very rapidly. So I'm not worried about Mad Max. I think that the fracture. So I think that the regime the ruling classes are very fragile. And when faced with fracture, will completely lose all control. And by all control, I mean their ability to dictate society in order to allow themselves to be on top, to extract value from the productive members of society, and to assign that value to the people who support the regime. Whether that's the people who are directly working in the vast federal bureaucracy, or the kind of people who work in government schools, grooming children, or whatever. All these people, if the regime loses power, will immediately be unable to feed themselves, simply because they don't provide any value, and no one, unless they get charity, people will not be able to. They won't be able to eat. So if you see a fracture, and a fracture would result for the regime from some external cause, losing a war, or like I say, a real pandemic, an economic collapse, what you'll see is the current regime structures just disappearing. And there's many historical analogs for this. The most recent actually is the collapse of the regimes in 1989, communist Eastern Europe, something I know a lot about because I'm half Hungarian. And the regime just disappears overnight. And in those cases, a new regime formed because there was enough actual value production for people to kind of reform society quite rapidly. Our problem is that we have much less actual value production and a vastly greater percentage of parasites. So the kind of societal disturbances would be much greater. When I say I expect a regime fracture by 2030, that's what I mean. I mean, basically, the stupid is going to get squeezed out of the system. Best case scenario, everyone adopts a more realistic attitude and tries to provide value. Much more likely we end up in some kind of civil conflict.
Well, that's always the thing that I think about, because when I look at a country like the UK, I mean, they're at the risk of being rude, they're screwed. Like, they're in a rough situation. But when I look at America, like, America on one hand has very severe problems, severe problems with immigration, severe problems with political division. But at kind of a 30,000 foot view, America is a prize just as a country to own. There are a lot of things worth having there, just raw resources. And so there's kind of to me at least, a limit on how badly our elites can play the game, just from the perspective of, well, if you're playing that badly, someone else looks at your territory and says, well, I'd like some of that, not necessarily from the outside, but on the inside.
Yes.
Like, to me, it's the idea of like a civil war is kind of poisoned by like 90s right-wing kooks and people imagining, like, oh, the South will rise again. Like, that was a different time. But the idea that, DeSantis 2 in, 10 years is like, all right, yeah, I'm still part of America. Fine, whatever. I'll fly the flag. But he basically does whatever he wants. He controls it. He pays his own goons. The federal goons don't have enough money to go down there and get him. And essentially, much like, kind of like, and I don't want to bring it in, but much like, like the late Roman Empire, there are still people who go around and call themselves emperors or Roman generals, and they dress like it, and they of course they say all the same things, but do they listen to Rome? In our case, will they listen to DC? No. And so to me, that seems much more realistic.
Yeah, I think it's very realistic. I'm a little bit less sanguine about the idea of the existing federal government surviving, simply because the central powers in all of history before us were much more based in reality. That is much less insane. These people are fundamentally insane. That is, they cannot grasp reality. And so I think they're unlikely to survive in any meaningful way, simply because they just, they've surrounded themselves with these parasites and sycophants and incompetence. I mean, just, I did, in one of my pieces I wrote recently, I'm like, well, all these people are, you take a look, and I gave a link to the Biden cabinet. I'm like, would you trust any of these people to clean your toilets? You just wouldn't. I mean, the quality, the caliber of people who are running in the regime just isn't adequate to allow them to survive if DeSantis too decides to ignore them, because they'll just flip their lid, and then it'll be the worst for them. But I do think definitely that what we're most likely to end up with is either de jure or de facto a set of 2 to 5 successor states out of what constitutes the present United States.
Well, I very much hope you're right. I think all of us are kind of in this situation of, kind of reading the tea leaves. And I think that there's broad agreement on the fact that a regime is not being run well. I think the big question is, well, one, how long can they keep it up, and two, what comes next?
Yes.
So Charles, we're coming up on time. Is there anything you want to say, to wrap up your thoughts?
No, other than I'd like to state that I'm an optimist. I mean, this all sounds pessimistic, right? This kind of goes to your point that America is a prize, but it's not just the physical characteristics of America that make it a prize. I actually think that there's, compared to a place like England, and I have English cousins and I'm quite familiar with England, compared to a place like England or Europe, America could turn it around, and the people of America could turn it around and take the awesome gifts that America has, and maybe it'd be a couple different countries, but that's fine. You could easily imagine a future America which is not that different from current America. It's that you don't have to have a complete, it's not like the end of the Roman Empire where there's nothing but ruins left. I'm optimistic that in your lifetime, and you're younger than me, and even in my lifetime, but in your relevant lifetime, that is when you're still a relatively young adult or early middle age, you can have a not ashes, but a bright and enjoyable future society for you and your children. And I think that's what we should all be working towards. Less, not just complaining, but actually working towards that to the extent it's possible at any given time.
Well, I think that's a great note to end it out on. Is there anything you want to plug, your links where people can find more of you?
Go ahead. You check out theworthyhouse.com. I'm on Twitter, but I'm not really a hot takes person on Twitter. I cross post my stuff I write elsewhere, but I have probably 500, 600 fairly lengthy pieces on the Worthy House. So there's something for everyone. If you're interested in dipping into that, history or politics or certain kinds of philosophy, it's all there. So check it out. Oh, I don't raise any money. So, I don't need the money. I'm not going to ask you for money. You don't have to subscribe. You can just go there and check it out.
Well, as someone who is not yet a gentleman farmer, but is very much trying to be one, I will accept your money. As per usual, the links are down in the description. This show is available always on YouTube for free. But additionally, my most recent 10 episodes are available on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And the scheme I have worked out for that is that after it falls out of the most recent 10, it goes behind a paywall. And if you support me anywhere, I've got multiple options down in the description. I'll give you a link that will give you the access to my entire audio-only backlog. It's not huge, but it is a little bit of utility for you guys, and it helps me cover the cost of the show. Anyway, just other announcements. I will have Scrump on tomorrow. We'll have a discussion with him. And that should be the only episodes for this week. And anyway, guys, keep your head up. Remember, the lie can't last forever. Good night, everyone.